Welcome to this month's Creation Justice webinar, a gathering place for building a faith-rooted and faith-sustained movement addressing many of the critical issues of our time. I'm Brooks Barrett, the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. I am joined by my co-host, the Reverend Michael Malcolm, who is the Executive Director for the People's Justice Council and Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. Michael, one could say that media like what we have today didn't exist in biblical times. So how are we making this a faith issue? Now, I'm thinking, yes, Fox News didn't cover the Roman Empire or the crucifixion, but let me read a verse from the Bible that I have been pondering lately. Paul in 2 Corinthians talks about those who come and proclaim another Jesus than the one we proclaim. About such persons, Paul then says, for such boasters are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. I think it's safe to say charlatans who dress themselves up in religious beliefs still exist, whether they are televangelists or politicians. Particular persons might come to mind. Now, is it not a faith issue if these persons have their views broadcast into millions of homes on a daily and hourly basis? Maybe I'm wrong. What are your thoughts, Michael?
No, Brooks, I I mean, I most certainly don't think you're wrong. Um, I'd even want to add to that a little bit. I'd want to add to that particular part of the conversation. Isn't it our job as people of faith and people of conscience to uphold the truth? And what is it if our pulpits aren't, our broadcast booth? Uh, if we are prophets of God, if we are people of conscience, then we are tasked to proclaim the truth in power. We can't allow for falsities to reign when we know the truth. In essence, we ought to be the counter narrative that this world so desperately needs right now. We should be that antidote to those untruths. And I look forward to our conversation today. I look forward to hearing from our guests so that we can have an even deeper dive into our convictions on what it looks like for us to be those trumpeters of truth. Look forward to it today. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I'm already envisioning a T-shirt that says "We are the antidote." I think that's got some potential there. Let me introduce our guest in the reverse order in which they'll be speaking. We all have with us today Elyse Martin, who is the manager of persuasion research and campaigns at the Environmental Defense Fund and runs its anti-misinformation brigade and the associated newsletter entitled Based in Climate Reality. Among previous positions, Elyse has also been an anti-disinformation manager at Progress Now. A couple of fun facts. She enjoys reading, singing in a choir, and embroidery. She also has 2 cats. Allison Fisher will be speaking to us today, and she has been the Director of Climate and Energy Program for Media Matters since 2019. She was previously the Outreach Director of Public Citizens Climate and Energy Program. She resides in Washington, D.C. with her 7-year-old daughter and 2 cats. Cheryl Leanza serves as policy advisor to the United Church of Christ Media Justice Ministry. She has led successful public policy campaigns that have ended the predatory cost of communicating with incarcerated people, given access to communications by disabled incarcerated people, and created a subsidy for low-income families to defray monthly internet costs. A key question for Cheryl is whether or not she has 2 cats. Cheryl, we'll hear from you next.
Hi, Brooks. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. for having me here. I'm so glad to be with my UCC comrades. I wanted to say a quick shout out to Reverend Jim Montal, who used to serve at the UCC Media Justice Board. I'm located on Piscataway land in Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. And so I would like to start for a minute. I'm going to share my slides. I'm going to share a little bit very quickly about the UCC Media Justice Ministry, and then we will quickly get into some more about the media. Now, Jim was saying, Brooks was saying, why does the church care about the media? And I'm here to tell you that if you are among the group folks here who are UCC members, the UCC is actually really well known for being a leader on media justice and communications rights. And we got started back in 1959 when the denomination was first very close to when the denomination was first founded. And Dr. Everett Parker, who was the communications director at the time, created the ministry after a prophetic conversation with Dr. Martin Luther King, as we're getting close to his birthday. And they concluded together that the UCC should work on making sure the TV stations in the South serve their communities, particularly their Black community members, their Black residents and viewers. And it's a really great, fascinating story, but it wound up that the UCC actually had to sue the Federal Communications Commission to get the agency to just listen to them. And at the very end of this work, they eventually got the license taken away from a local TV station to make sure that it more accurately covered justice issues, and particularly the civil rights movement. That the news and information about the civil rights movement used to get just pulled off the air at that station in Jackson, Mississippi. So I actually today routinely work with communications lawyers and advocates, and they don't know even that much about the UCC. They're like, oh, is it really a church? Because they know the UCC versus FCC case, because it's a pretty big deal. So why do we care about media? Very important question. And so, it might be kind of simplistic for folks who are just strong justice advocates, but it's also very good to make sure that we are focused on what we're doing and why we're doing it. So first of all, media is important. It educates you outside of your direct experience. It can validate particular facts, points of view, or narratives. It identifies common problems. And this is really important. For example, if you know that your kid's asthma is getting worse and worse, that's one thing. But if you know every kid in your neighborhood or other kids across the country, asthma is getting worse and worse, that might be entirely something else altogether. So really being able to identify common problems and hear about problems that maybe don't affect you directly, but affect others is a really important role of the media. And of course, it undergirds democracy, right? We all have to vote. So much of our public policy about the environment and so many other important social issues is made because people learn about what's happening and they decide what's important based on that information. And so when we work on media justice, as you might kind of think about for environmental justice, right? So media justice is not only trying to make the best use of the system we have now. So can you creatively, write a press release or do a protest that will catch the attention of the media, but also why is the media doing what it's doing? What can we change about who owns it or how it's structured so that it will more naturally cover important issues like the environment, like racial justice, or whatever issues. We like to say that there's no social justice without media justice, because people need that to make their work move ahead. So that's a quick picture there. And the other thing I wanted to focus on is local media. A lot of folks don't realize you're watching TV, you're watching cable, you're like, what is this that I'm seeing? But local media, right? That's stuff that's about what's happening in maybe your state or your community and your city. And why is it important? Well, as it turns out, local media has a huge number of incredibly important impacts. It gets more voting and more civic engagement. Local news is actually less polarized than national news. You get local community, local elected leaders are going to be held more accountable. And that's particularly important. There's actually a great factoid, which is if a local community is going up for a bond or something like that, and they need insurance for the government to be operating well, that insurance actually goes up. The cost of it goes up if they don't have a solid local media, because the insurers have figured out that it's more likely that there's going to be graft or mismanagement in a local community if there's no local media. So it really has a direct impact. And when you have news that relates information to yourself, either your local community or your lived experience, that makes it much more likely that you're going to take action. Do you know that there's PFAS in the water? Maybe. Do you know that there's PFAS in the water? This kind of water bottle that is popular with teenagers, and also your community's water has been tested and is high in this certain, pollutant. That's really going to change how you view this issue as what kind of local information, if it's going to be activating for you. And then the more local news, the more accurate people have, the better news. It crowds out the mis and disinformation, which I know we're going to hear about later. And there's plenty of examples of when a local journalist was either deployed or whatever and has improved environmental outcomes, that there's better able to change public policy. So these are, I've got a ton of studies. Most of them are on this this link, and I'm happy to work with Brooks to make sure everybody gets the slides if you want them. But local news is really important. And here's just a few facts, but you might be thinking like, okay, so doesn't everybody just get their news online? And it's like, yes, most people get their news online, but who's creating that news? If you get your news on Facebook or Twitter, there's no journalists that work for Facebook, right? So those journalists have to work somewhere else. So where does that news come from? And today, even though newspapers are terribly under threat, the number of stories, the good stories, the stories that I just talked about, the ones that are about local important issues that are well resourced, majority of them come from newspapers, but then a decent amount also come from radio and television. But there's not very little still from online only sources, because there's really just an emerging sector of like high quality local online content. But unfortunately, journalism jobs are plummeting. And also we have TV stations around the country, which is a pretty good source of news, but not that many of them actually produce local news. And finally, another thing to kind of understand about the broader environment is that there are specific policies that Facebook and Twitter, which is now called X, have adopted that reduce the likelihood that you're going to see authentic journalism on the page, or that you're going to be able to go to it. So like Twitter doesn't do links anymore. Like that's highly disfavored by their algorithm. Facebook really just wants you to show you your friends and family, and they really reduce the amount of access to news. So there's all these things that are now structurally getting in the way of us getting this really great news and information that will help us work on social justice and work on the environment. So those are the sources. So I wanted to get a little bit to the root. Who's controlling these newspapers and television stations? And so my question for you, if you want to put it in the chat, is to quickly think, do you think you know which company owns the most TV stations in the country? I don't know if I'm going to be able to see the chat since I'm displaying my screen, but I want you guys to guess, and I'm willing to bet that nobody is going to guess it. So let's see. Okay, the number one company in the country's name is Nexstar. The second is Gray, then Tegna, then Sinclair. Maybe you've heard of Sinclair, and then we get to Fox and the rest of the networks. So you're like, wait a minute, I never heard of these companies. What is going on? Now, these are in order by their revenue, but if you look, you'll see this actual coverage line column in the chart, and you can see this is how much of the country they reach. So Nexstar reaches 70% of the country. You'll see down below, Scripps at number 9 reaches a similar amount of the country, but they don't make as much money doing it. And you're like, I don't understand. How does that work? Well, I'm going to show you this example. This is a great picture here of the Hearst TV stations. You're going to see Hearst is a company. It's actually one of the few good independent companies around. I mean, none of these companies are perfect, but relatively. And they own stations locally around the country, but they're all affiliated with different networks. If you look there, they're like, oh, some are ABC, some are NBC, some are Fox, some are the CW. So the company that owns your local station, those are the people who are producing the news. Those are the people who are hiring your local journalists that you see every day. They're the ones who are doing this, and they are not necessarily affiliated with one network or another, right? The national network creates the national shows, the stuff you see on prime time. But the local stuff, that's controlled by this company, the particular company, like I said, like Nexstar or Hearst. And these are the companies that often want to merge. And then often that results in reduced local journalism, because a lot of times what these companies are doing, they'll manufacture journalism for one location, and then they'll also display it on other TV stations around. They'll have an agreement. So you might be able to see there's like some purple dots on this picture. Like there's a couple down there. I think that's in Naples, Florida, and they that probably Channel 2, that news station, creates the news, and then it also is shown on Channel 7. So it's not different news. It's the same news. It's just on 2 different TV stations because one company is owning it and making the news for both. And then these are the top newspaper owners. And I think the most important thing to know here is everywhere you see those diamond star things are where newspapers have been brought out by private equity. I don't know how much you guys follow private equity in terms of the business model, but what they do in newspapers is they buy the newspaper, they fire the journalist, they make it this empty paper. There's even a nickname for it in the studies. It's called a ghost newspaper. There are hundreds and hundreds of counties around this country that don't have any local source of news. They don't have a local source of news from a newspaper, from a TV station, nothing. They're called news deserts, and it's a really increasing problem. And one of the big features and the reasons that we are moving that way is because of this takeover by newspapers, by private equity, which really just hollows out these companies. So, and you can see here's a couple of statistics that show you the bad things that happen. And one of the other bad things that happen is national news goes up, which means polarization goes up, and local news goes down, and reporters get fired. So I'm going to quickly leave you with a couple of solutions. I know we have a lot of solutions also about misinformation, disinformation coming up. But one of the things that we do at UCC Media Justice is fight mergers at the Federal Communications Commission. And often we need people who live where the TV stations are to sign a declaration and just say, I live here. And so that is really helpful. Learning how to behave online. And you should subscribe to good local media yourself. Make sure you put your money where your mouth is. If you want people to know about important stuff, make sure that there's somebody to pay those journalists. You can monitor environmental coverage, for example, in your local community. We've got some resources with regard to that. And also, although it's not necessarily media related, obviously there's a lot of crossover. Our communications advocacy space is really focused on artificial intelligence, and we know there's some serious environmental impacts for that too. So there's lots of great things to do, but we'd love to see you at UCC Media Justice. And really thanks again for having me here, and hope you're all well.
Thank you, Cheryl. I much appreciated that. And we'll turn now to Allison.
Hi, I loved that. It was a great presentation, and can't underscore how important local media has been in combating misinformation. Oh, I'm getting a note here. Host asked you. Okay, starting my video. Here we go. Okay, let me get my slides up to share. Okay, perfect. All right, I'm going to dive right in. This is an overview of what I'm going to cover in the next 10 minutes or so. I'm not sure, Brooks, the charlatan that you were referring to, but I am briefly going to discuss how right-wing media did help facilitate Trump's return to the White House. We're going to look specifically at Trump's relationship with Fox News. And then finally, we're going to delve into the current state of climate misinformation, but really focusing on the way misinformation is proliferating around these increasingly extreme weather events that we've seen currently in LA, but then in the fall, Hurricane Helene and Milton. Okay, right-wing media's influence on the election. So I think it can be credibly argued that Trump owes his return to power in part to the right-wing media ecosystem. I'm going to focus on the 2024 campaign, but I think it's really important to note that Trump became the Republican presidential nominee in the first place because right-wing media helped him weather just countless scandals and lies that would have ended the careers of most politicians, including his role in the January 6th insurrection. So just a little background about how right-wing media works and why they're so effective and why they're even able to have an outside influence on an election is a couple of things. So first, they collectively create an alternative reality like this bubble that we talk about that is like based on this constant barrage of grievances that keep their audiences kind of outraged. They seem impervious to fact checks or truth. And they, by and large, dissuade their audiences to seek sources outside of this conservative echo chamber. So whether that's experts, scientists, climate scientists, federal officials, or even other journalists or media, they keep them away from those other sources. So let's go ahead and look at some more specific ways in which the right-wing media marshaled its influence in service of Trump's campaign. And here we've identified 4 ways. They flooded the zone with false narratives. One prominent example that folks may be familiar with, maybe not, is the way Fox News in particular boosted Trump's campaign by falsely blaming Biden and Harris for this surge of violent migrant crime. Even though this was not based in reality, violent crime had actually and is actually plummeting from the heights it reached during Trump's first presidency. But this was completely ignored, and they kept pushing forward with this narrative. In fact, immigrants in general were often used as scapegoats, which is another core right-wing media tactic that we've identified here. For example, conservative media and Trump falsely claimed that federal aid that was needed during Hurricane Helene to help people in North Carolina had been siphoned off for migrant programs. Now, despite several statements from FEMA officials, from the president, from any number of fact checks from other media, most right-wing media figures never stop peddling to this day this lie, because it really supports Trump's platform and his policy around immigration. Later in the campaign, a string of former Republican officials and Trump's own aides came forward with these very dire warnings of what a second Trump presidency would mean for the country. Right-wing media hid this news from its audiences. So, for example, his former chief of staff called him, quote, a fascist at his core. His former defense secretary called him a threat to democracy. All of this is disqualifying for most people, all people probably, for presidency. But he was shielded from this from Fox and others. And then lastly, right-wing media, by and large, just kept quiet on a host of unpopular aspects of Trump's policy agenda, including Social Security to reproductive rights. Okay, so their influence on Trump's presidency with Fox News, and by they I mean right-wing media in general, but Fox News is kind of at the center of this ecosystem, right? And their influence does not end or begin with the campaign. And I think this quote is, I think this quote from CNN's Brian Stelter is very, very telling. But basically it was, really well known before his first bid at the presidency that Trump was an obsessive Fox viewer whose worldview was probably shaped by the network's programming. Media Matters documented early in his presidency what is now called the Trump-Fox feedback loop, where basically Trump was getting his information. Remember, he has access to the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the world as president, but he's getting his information from Fox News, and then basically live tweeting the network's more popular opinion programs. And Fox hosts and guests are very acutely aware of this feedback loop. And so they're often responding to that by at times trying to advise the president on any number of issues or gain favor with him or approval up from him through his television, and in some cases, it can even be seen as auditioning for appointment in his administration. At least 20 people with Fox on their resumes were part of his first administration. Since his election to a second term, Trump has named 18 current or former employees to high-ranking positions. And just to underscore this point about prospective Trump administration officials auditioning for Fox News, the most recent appointment, a man named Leo Terrell, who Trump announced on January 9th, just recently, to serve in the civil rights branch of the AG office, had just hours before appeared on Fox News and told his audiences that the Los Angeles Fire Department has no intention of putting out the fires, and linked its performance to DEI nonsense. What he's referring to there is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So for context, Durrell is a California, formerly radio personality, who joined the Fox News network as a contributor in 2021. His on-air commentary has included comparing Black Lives Matters to ISIS, and claiming that Democrats have basically declared war on white people. And now this man is going to be part of the Trump administration as of the 9th. Okay, moving into the current state of climate misinformation. These are just some screenshots I wanted to share from content that we've done in recent years around extreme weather events. We know that extreme weather events are the most visceral and visible form of climate impact. They usually occupy the national news cycle for several days, which is offering both the opportunity for climate communicators, but also a platform for climate deniers and bad actors to push misinformation, usually attached to a very specific agenda. So, right-wing media pushing climate denial and misinformation in the wake of these events is not necessarily something new. Media Matters has been documenting this issue for more than a decade, as have others. So what I wanted to do is just kind of recap what climate disinformation or misinformation has historically looked like in these moments, but I want to spend a little bit more time on discussing some of the really troubling trends that we've seen the last couple of years, including more recently the misinformation around Hurricane Helene and what we're seeing kind of currently playing out around the LA fires. So what has it historically looked like? So for decades, right-wing media has tried to deny the relationship between climate change and extreme weather. Some of the typical arguments they've used looking at these, like during an extreme heat event, you might hear the connection between climate dismissed as just merely summer. Or you might hear the red herring argument that cold kills more than heat. During a superstorm or a major hurricane, you might hear that there's no evidence that climate change is making hurricanes more frequent. Even though scientists are not arguing that, they're arguing that they're making hurricanes more intense. During major wildfires, you typically hear forest management alone and not climate change is to blame for how extreme the fire season has gotten. Now, these arguments, these false arguments still persist, but now due to an increasingly fractured media and also kind of this expanding network of conservative far right media spaces and figures, we're seeing even more dangerous information that both seeks to find an alternative explanation of why these events are becoming so bad and so destructive, and looking for someone, often a political opponent or a misaligned group, to blame. And I wanted to share a quote from one of my colleagues, Matt Kurtz, who just recently wrote about the LA fires. Quote, "When any major story breaks, the top priority for the host on Fox News, Trumpist social media influencers, and the rest of the echo chamber is to identify scapegoats for their audiences to rage against." That kind of sums up the moment that we're in right now. And just to put some examples to that, in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, as I noted earlier, bad actors in right-wing media pushed the lie that migrants, and not just migrants, places like Ukraine had received aid at the expense of communities, American communities in North Carolina. They also pushed the lie that the federal government was intentionally abandoning communities that had once voted for Trump. Other lies included the conspiracy that North Carolina had intentionally been targeted using weather manipulation. And these are just really a few of the lies and falsehoods that polluted the information system in the wake of Helene. Immediately following the outbreak of the fires in LA, we've seen a very similar polluted information system where bad actors are really using the tragedy to target political opponents. And this time, instead of scapegoating immigrants, though there still is some of that, right-wing media is suggesting that DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion hires were responsible for letting the fires spread so rapidly. So what is the purpose of all of this? We know that the main purpose of climate misinformation, initially pushed by the fossil fuel industries starting decades and decades ago, was to create doubt about whether or not climate change was occurring in order to weaken the case for action that would ultimately hurt those industries. And as I noted, climate denial is still part of the landscape, but then layered on top of that is, conspiracy theories like weather manipulation or other conspiratorial explanations intended to replace climate change as part of the conversation. Misinformation that erodes trust in the institutions that respond to disasters like FEMA, or targets those tasked with communicating to the public this life-saving information that we need in these moments, is particularly dangerous. And as a result, during Hurricane Helene, again, for example, local and state officials of both parties, right, Democrats and Republicans, were begging right-wing media and other bad actors to stop the lies. Charlotte Observer, there was probably others, but Charlotte Observer and the government had to set up specific pages and websites to address the most prominent lies, which certainly meant that they were taking resources in a moment of great catastrophe and disaster, that they were taking that needed first responders and needed journalists. They were taking resources away from these areas. TV news dedicated hours debunking hurricane related misinformation. And as a result, instead of discussing the role of climate change, instead of bringing on experts to discuss how to make our communities more resilient to climate, instead of their audiences like ultimately becoming more conversant, and this new reality and what local, state, and federal government can do to prepare, the media had to try to combat just a tidal wave of misinformation. So there's real sidelining here of important national conversations that are getting missed, right, around these events at the expense of kind of wading through what is and what is not true during these disasters when they're unfolding and for some time thereafter. On the ground, and I'm wrapping up here, on the ground, FEMA workers and first responders were dealing with threats and actual violence that disrupted the response and that stemmed from the misinformation about the federal response that was happening online and coming out of the mouths of like very influential people. So there's real consequence to misinformation, and I wanted to bring that to you guys today. And just kind of in closing, and what I'll leave you with is something I think about all the time, is that I think that there was, because I've been doing this for a little bit, I think there was this belief at one point that once we started to really start experiencing climate change at the scale that we are now, that climate denial would cease to exist. But on the contrary, it remains, and that's very clear. And then what has morphed into these kind of new destructive ways that, you know, our community, people that care about these issues are ultimately going to be tasked with dealing with. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Allison, for that highly informative presentation. And we now
depressing, and I apologize for how depressing that was.
Yeah. No, we appreciate it. Thank you. And we turn now to Elyse for our final presentation.
Thank you very much, everyone. And as I am queuing up my slides, I just want to thank Reverend Dr. Brooks Bent and Reverend Michael Malcolm, as well as the other panelists, for setting this all up and working on this, and to Andrea Burse, apologies if I did not pronounce that correctly, for the tech support. Okay, so now that we know a little bit more about why there is so much mis and disinformation around what the major world events that are kind of collecting misinformation and disinformation are, and what its impacts are, I wanted to end today's webinar by talking about what individual actions you can take to combat mis and disinformation. So the first step is figuring out if what you're seeing actually is mis or disinformation. Ask yourself 3 questions when you are looking at something that you're not sure is true or not, and then verify whether or not it is true. So first, ask, do you recognize the source? Does it reference a source that you can easily find? Second, does the information in the post seem believable? Third, is it written in the style you'd expect from a professional news organization? If you answered no to any of the questions on the left, you can use any of these sites listed here to double check the facts. They include Science Feedback, PolitiFact, Fact Checker, Snopes.com, and Lead Stories. And I'd also like to give a shout out here to Media Matters, since they do really excellent work in pinpointing what narratives, shall we say, are false and which ones are true, and who is spreading them. So I'd be happy to share these slides afterwards if you don't have a chance to jot down this list right now. So let's say that you've done all this and figured out that what you're seeing is disinformation. What do you do? Step 2 is don't spread it. Why not, do you ask? Because the first rule of fighting disinformation is don't engage with the disinformation. Don't retweet or repost it. That gives the post engagement. That in turn introduces disinformation to people that would otherwise not know about it, or convinces social media platforms' algorithm that it is an important story that people like and are interested in. And if you engage with disinformation, that can sometimes be seen as acknowledging the spreader of disinformation as a worthy opponent or somebody who has a point. So we know now why it's not a good idea to engage with a post spreading a lie about, say, what fire trucks have been sent down from Oregon to help with the California wildfires. What should you do instead? Second rule of fighting disinformation is instead posting the truth. Make sure that if you are going to share information that it is 1, verified by a trustworthy source, and 2, based in fact. Then share something that we in the mis and disinformation business called a truth sandwich. So called because you've got two slices of bread, the truth, and in the middle, you've got the misinformation and the logic that shows how somebody is trying to trick you into believing this misinformation. I have an example here of a common piece of misinformation around electric vehicles. So, fact, driving an EV is cleaner than even the most efficient gas-powered car, and EVs will only get cleaner as our electric grid gets cleaner. The misinformation is, of course, there are emissions from building every vehicle. Due to battery manufacturing, greenhouse gas emissions from building EVs are slightly higher than those from manufacturing a gasoline vehicle. Then the logic. Those who want to keep the status quo rather than transition to a clean energy future conveniently leave out fact number 1. And then I end with another fact. Those increased emissions are quickly offset by zero tailpipe emissions during operation for the life of the vehicle. So the goal here is to frame a piece of misinformation with the truth, both at the beginning, so people are primed to understand that what misinformation they may have seen is not true, and then again at the end to reinforce that. In the middle, you also want to explain why the misinformation works, because misinformation and disinformation are designed to trick you, to get you to believe something that is not true, but feels true. Okay, so while it's great to post a truth sandwich, we do have to acknowledge the fact that arguing with strangers online rarely changes hearts and minds. If you see mis or disinformation online, you have 2 other options in addition to making your own post. The first is to report it to the social media platform, and the second is to make a community note on said platform. Reporting it can get the piece of disinformation taken off the platform entirely. A community note can give vital context that keeps people from believing the mis or disinformation. Here I have 2 lists of what platforms allow you to report misinformation and what platforms require a community note. Unfortunately, reporting mis and disinformation on social media platforms has become harder in recent years, and it became even harder this month, unfortunately, when Mark Zuckerberg released a video saying he is moving from using professional fact checkers on Facebook and using community notes instead, except in the EU, which has different regulations on mis and disinformation. That doesn't mean that it's impossible to get disinformation off of a platform. The websites that allow reporting are usually pretty responsive. And if you are bothered by the amount of mis and disinformation you see on platforms like X or any of the Meta platforms, you can join and add community notes, which show up underneath a post showing, why something is not true. There is also an alternative third step, which is taking it offline. If you know the person introducing mis and disinformation to your Facebook feed, it's often more effective to open up a dialogue with them offline. So if you do decide to talk with a loved one about mis and disinformation, here are some key things to keep in mind. Number 1, pick your battles. Unfortunately, not everyone is going to be open to changing their mind. Only enter into the arena when you're in private. People tend to shut down with public confrontation and with someone who you think will listen to you. Number 2, emphasize your relationship and what you have in common. Sometimes people gravitate towards conspiracy theories or misinformation in search of a community or an easy explanation for frightening situations. Showing that they have connections outside of, say, QAnon circles can often help people escape from those kinds of mindsets. Plus, it's much easier to believe someone that you know and trust and with whom you already have a pre-established relationships and a lot of other things in common. Number 3, focus on their motivation for believing in the mis or disinformation. Are they frightened about hurricanes, and that's why they believe the government can control them, for example? If you work together to address the source of the fear, that might help your loved one more than an argument. It's also important to note that people gravitate towards fake news out of confirmation bias. That is, they seek out information that already justifies their worldview. So attacking their worldview may make them shut down. Number 4, aim for a dialogue, not a lecture. Talking down to someone can also make them shut down. It might also confirm to them that the so-called mainstream is out to attack the truth tellers like them. Number 5, show empathy and stay patient. No one likes admitting they fell for fake news or that they're wrong about something important. As I mentioned in point 2, misinformation thrives when people are afraid. Perfect love drives out fear, as someone once wrote. So remember your loved one is loved, remind them of that, and reassure them of that fact. When we feel seen, heard, and understood, we are much more willing to open our hearts and minds. And you can always visit the Environmental Defense Fund's article, How to Tackle Misinformation When It's Coming from a Loved One, for a more in-depth guide here. Now, step 4 is optional, but I would also encourage everyone to sign up for EDF's Anti-Misinformation Brigade. Once a month, we send out a newsletter that offers tips for tackling mis and disinformation, like what to do if you see anti-wind turbine content that jeopardizes clean energy projects in your community, or proof and counter narratives to longstanding climate misinformation narratives, like EV batteries not lasting a long time. It's an easy way to keep up with everything that's going on without getting overwhelmed. And there you have it, 3, maybe 4 steps to take to combat mis and disinformation in your own life. Thank you very much for your time and for having me on the panel.
Thank you so much. Those were 3 excellent presentations, much to discuss and think about. Michael, do you have a question to get us started for our Q&A period?
Actually, I found something that Cheryl said to be interested in, and I wanted to pick back up on it, Cheryl. You talked about the amount of people who weren't able to get information in certain communities and cities. And so I'm wondering, does the World Wide Web or internet access play into that statistic? As well as, do you have demographics that you can give for that as well?
Thanks. Yeah. So that statistic was about geographic areas that don't have any journalists producing news. So it's not really about internet access. Internet access is really important because people can get, more information if they have internet access, and I could talk all day about that. But this was more about which communities don't have any journalists because the newspapers have shut down, the TV stations don't cover. And in fact, it's interesting, the places that don't have news are more likely to be low income, conservative, rural. So, they actually did some studies, and if you're talking about, for example, the election, predominantly Trump voters are in places where there's no sources of local news. So I can pull out a study for you. I can share a link with everyone. But it's the News Desert Study, and out of University of North Carolina, and it's very, very interesting. But they track how many places are losing, how many counties are losing news over time. So the only information, there's nothing that says down the street this is happening, what's happening in city council, or anything like that.
Thanks for that response. Your presentation stimulated for me a lot of thoughts about how do we kind of confront this situation. You pointed us to some great solutions. I can almost see some green teams practicing and role-playing conversations like on how to confront or counter disinformation. My mind is also thinking about kind of the more like systemic approach to this problem. I feel like, 25 years ago, I remember seeing like kind of a lot of the independent media centers popping up as like kind of this maybe attempt to have kind of an alternative, I don't know, way of confronting corporate media or nonprofit newspapers. But it does seem like a troubling situation because of that close enmeshment between government and the media industry, all the way up to the top. And so it's just how does one go about tackling that in sort of a policy-oriented or systemic way?
Does anybody else want to answer? I mean, like I said, this is what UCC Media Justice works a lot on, and it has to do with trying to increasing competition, like there are local news right now. The biggest effort we have to sort of create more news and more journalism has to do with philanthropy and changing some of the policies that will enable news gathering and news production to be considered more like a public good, more like, say, a public park in terms of how it's treated tax-wise. We used to be able to rely on a vibrant commercial media to cover our news, and you'd buy the newspaper and it was a business. There still are businesses that do that, but now a lot of it has to do with sort of, one of the solutions I had was there's a journalism initiative fellowship where philanthropists are sort of paying for journalists to embed, and sometimes they actually do even focus on particular issue areas. There was for years a very successful one that focused on health, but you could even imagine that focusing on journalism. And like I said, it requires people to recognize that information is not free, good journalism is not free, and so your role to play is to pay for good journalism. You really do have to contribute. That's not just to your local NPR station, but your community media, community radio station, and then making sure that they you stay on them, make sure that they, you listen, you give feedback, you offer, suggestions so that they know that you as a viewer or listener is disappointed, or a reader is disappointed if they're not covering the stories that you feel like are necessary. So there is sort of a slow change in the ecosystem, but I think we're moving to a place where it's a much more of a balance between commercial media and more of a nonprofit model. And there are new places opening up, but they really need your support because they're small and they need the revenue.
I just wanted to add, and this is not directly responding to the question of policy, but one of the reasons why right-wing media has been so effective, and I alluded to this a little bit in my presentation, I mean, Donald Trump has played a big role in this idea of demonizing anything that is critical of kind of this right-wing worldview, and labeling those outlets or newspapers or whatever as fake news if they're pushing back against anything that they say, or any of the policies that they're putting forward, and trying to tear down this trust in these institutions, to the point where there's no authoritative source. And so I think some of the problem with maybe new generations of social media viewers or news consumers now is that they don't even understand this concept of like, what's a reliable source? What's an authoritative source? So they're finding all this information, maybe even from handles that are not even a real name. Like we have this one that we mention all the time. It's called Cat Turd, and he's just like this like chaos agent that's always putting out this terrible information, but has a huge influence on the conversation online. And is always pushing kind of these bad narratives or misinformation. So when you have like a group of users that don't have basic media literacy, then you're already starting kind of on a back foot. Like that has to be kind of a foundation, and whether or not that's happening at churches or at schools, or kind of like these basic levels of civic engagement, like I think that the problem is not going to get better.
So as I'm looking at the chat, and I'm thinking about Birmingham, Alabama. So Alabama Power owns the oldest Black newspaper in Birmingham. But Alabama Power, or in the state of Alabama, we pay we have some of the lowest rates, but the highest bills in the nation. There's no way to in any way advocate through the media against that, because they own the media. Reverend Jim talked about in Texas, the newspaper is owned by the fossil fuel. How are we to combat that? What should we be doing to be the counter narrative or that antidote for that toxicity?
I would say this is where, once again, we go to needing more and more outlets, and creating policies to permit more people to enter the newspaper and the broadcast industry. One of the things that we've been working on for a long time is trying to advocate so that the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, make sure that there's many more owners of TV stations. If only 10 companies own most of the TV stations, there's no way a little company could come in and buy a TV station and now compete independently. And it's very hard for a little TV station or a little newspaper to compete if everybody else is owned by this large conglomerate. For example, advertising, you can buy it on a nationwide scale instead of doing it at a local scale. So I think it goes back to working with these new initiatives. The Knight First Amendment Center has a really good set of initiatives that are trying to sort of do a church plant for news, for local news, to create these other local news situations so that you can create an independent source. So that there's more competition. We can't really shut down. I mean, and like I said, one of the things I really want to do is look more into about private equity, because I think there's ways to regulate private equity that I think will be across the board, across different sectors, because they're purchasing these products in other cases rather than just, the energy company owning a newspaper. They're purchasing products and then just removing journalism. So there's no longer a separate, daily newspaper that might offer a counter narrative to the newspaper that you have. We were talking about local TV station owners. One of them is Sinclair. Sinclair is a very conservative owner. He does have a lot of Fox affiliates, and he just bought the Baltimore Sun. So now in Baltimore, you have somebody who's extremely conservative in control of the newspaper, but we have a new online source called the Baltimore Banner. It's a little independent upstart of, a dozen journalists who are working together. And so I subscribe to the Baltimore Banner. I don't live in Baltimore, but I'm so excited to have this new paper, they're doing the journalism and doing the research. So I think it's like trying to create these separate news outlets, and then also just sharing your, local information. I'm sure you do that very well in your community to make sure that when these newspapers are making these statements, that they're not correct, that it's not journalism.
Brooks,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Cheryl. I'm sorry.
No.
I didn't mean to. I don't mean to. And Brooks, I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt. But I'm wondering, when we do our church announcements on Sundays, what would it look like for us to announce some of the community issues that are happening in the community that we serve? What would it look like for us to bring to the fore some of the policies that may harm our communities, or even some of the policies that we should be advocating for that help our communities? Not from a political bias standpoint, but just from an informative standpoint of letting people know that this is harmful for you or this is helpful for you. This is what they have coming up. You have an opportunity to speak publicly and let your opinions be known, and let that be a part of your public announcements on your Sunday service, at your Sunday services. How much more of a service that would be. And it's not very inconvenient to do something like that, being that you're doing it already. It's just that you have a more outward look than an inward look. I just wanted to add that into the gumbo because y'all cooking up in here. So, Brooks, I'll let you get back.
I love it. I love it. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. I want to end with a quote from the chat. Jamantal wrote, "One of the roles of the pulpit is to uphold Jesus' recognition that the truth will set you free." And we thank our panelists today for helping us generate some freedom movement here and some coming together to get out the truth that will set people free. We're grateful to each of us, each of you panelists, for being here today and having such terrific presentations. Thank you to our audience. We look forward to being back with you again next month for our next Creation Justice webinar. Take care, everyone, and God bless.